Beneath the Floorboards. The year was 1764, and the small village of Weatherby lay shrouded in the mist of ancient superstition. Nestled between rolling hills and dense woods, it seemed cut off from the rest of the world, a place where the past whispered secrets through crumbling ruins. At the edge of the village stood an imposing manor, its silhouette a jagged wound against the sky. Blackthorn Manor had stood empty for years, a place only the bold, or perhaps the dim-witted, dared enter. Jonathan Pierce was neither bold nor particularly dim-witted, but an interest in history and the occult had brought him to this place where most feared to tread. A scholar and avid chronicler of local legends, Jonathan arrived in Weatherby intent on uncovering the truth behind the manor and its bizarre stories. The villagers believed the house was under a curse. They talked of the sounds of muted screams heard beneath the floorboards and shadowy silhouettes caught in the windows, long after the last remnants of the inhabitants disappeared into the mist. Some said it was possessed by the spirits of the wronged who had been victimized hundreds of years ago. Others spoke of an evil sealed in the wooden planks beneath the hall's expanse. Jonathan dismissed their warnings as some kind of folklore, the byproduct of overactive imaginations. Armed with notebooks, candles, and his unwavering curiosity, he decided to spend a week in the manor to document its history and debunk once and for all the myths created around it. On a chilly September evening, Jonathan arrived at Blackthorn Manor. The air was damp, and the autumn leaves crunched beneath his boots as he approached the iron gate. It creaked open with a reluctant groan, as if warning him to turn back. He hesitated for a moment, the weight of the villagers' stories gnawing at his resolve, but he shook off the unease and pressed on. The house loomed bigger as he approached, with dark and lifeless windows. Ivy had taken hold of much of the outside, curling around stone walls like skeletal fingers. He pushed open the heavy oak door, and Jonathan was welcomed by the scent of mildew and decay. In the interior, it was like a tomb of silence, but every now and then there came a drip of water down the halls. Setting his lantern on a dusty table, Jonathan took in his surroundings. The grand entryway was dominated by a sweeping staircase, its banister warped with age. Faded portraits lined the walls, their subjects staring down with hollow eyes. A chill ran down his spine, but he dismissed it as nothing more than the cold air. "I've stayed in worse places," he muttered, his voice breaking the oppressive silence. Jonathan pitched his camp in the study, a room lined with bookshelves that sagged under the weight of forgotten tomes. Lighting a fire in the crumbling hearth, he opened his journal and began jotting down observations. The hours ticked by uneventfully, and Jonathan started to feel a fool for believing the villagers' stories. He was on the brink of sleep when he heard it, a faint, rhythmic tapping. It seemed to come from directly beneath him. He froze, his pulse quickening. "Rats," he whispered, though the sound was too deliberate, too patterned, to be the scurrying of rodents. The tapping ceased as suddenly as it had started. Jonathan tried to convince himself that it was nothing, and went to bed, but his sleep was fitful and filled with nightmares. The next morning, Jonathan roamed the house, his lantern casting long shadows that danced on the walls. He found a trapdoor in the dining room, hidden beneath a tattered rug. The villagers had said nothing about this. With some effort, he wriggled it open with a dark, narrow, and earth-leading staircase revealed. A foul smell greeted him, and he coughed. His rational head told him to leave that alone, but his curiosity prevailed. Descending the stairs, he found himself in a small chamber, stone-walled. He stepped on debris scattered on the floor and saw strange carvings on the walls, in symbols he could not understand. In the center of the room was a wooden chest with its lid sealed by rusty chains. Jonathan's heart pounded fast and wild as he stepped up to the chest. The air inside had a different weight. Indeed, he could sense something more of life itself because of its being. He touched the chains. He stumbled back immediately. "That's enough for today," he said to himself before walking away, heading upstairs again. That night, the tapping returned, this time louder and accompanied by faint whispers. Jonathan lay awake, clutching his lantern as the sounds seemed to move through the house. They stopped outside his door, and for a moment, he swore he saw the shadow of a figure beneath the crack. Summoning his courage, he threw the door open, but the hallway was empty. "This place is getting to me," he said, trying to convince himself he was imagining things. But deep down, he knew he wasn't. Something was beneath the floorboards, and it was growing restless. Jonathan comes to decide that he opens the trunk in the secret room, believing what is held within the secret contains the treasure of uncovering the past mysteries behind Manor. Approaching this, Jonathan could hear in the silent hollow a soft, guttural voice pronounce his name. Jonathan. The morning sun barely broke through the heavy clouds that surrounded the Blackthorn Manor, lending a somber hue to the grounds with its pale light. Jonathan spent the early hours pacing the study, replaying in his mind the events of the night. The whisper of his name and the skeletal hand that had emerged from beneath the floorboards were no figments of imagination. The chest, the strange artifacts inside it, and the cryptic Latin writings hinted at a truth more sinister than Jonathan could have imagined. He couldn't shake off the feeling that the house was alive, watching him through unseen eyes, waiting for him to make his next move. He delved into the worn, leather-bound book, which had fallen out of the chest, determined to make sense of the curse that bound this manor. The text within was all Latin and thick with language he didn't understand, peppered with arcane references to mystical rituals and rites. The words on this page read, "Under the timber there shall be a soul. For the release of the locked-in, blood must run red." The cryptic line sent a chill down his spine. Jonathan traced his fingers over the faded ink, trying to decipher its meaning. Blood? A soul? Was the house demanding a sacrifice? As he read further, he found the sketches that matched the symbols on the hidden chamber. They were portraying a ritual circle surrounded by runes, with a figure chained at its center. The figure's face was obscured, but its form was disturbingly human, bound by chains that seemed to writhe like living serpents. Beneath the image was a single phrase, "Do not awaken what lies beneath." Jonathan shut the book, his breath ragged. Whatever the Blackthorns had done, it had left a darkness that refused to fade. He had determined to see more and had started to explore parts of the house he had not visited. He found the east wing of the house, abandoned and falling apart, with a sense of foreboding in it. It was full of dusty furniture, torn curtains, and broken chandeliers all down the halls. In one room, he came upon a child's doll whose face had cracked porcelain and its age-faded dress. That sight made him feel this unexplainable wave of sorrow. Another depicted Matthias Blackthorn, the infamous patriarch of the family, hanging crookedly on the wall. The man's eyes, though painted, seemed to follow Jonathan's every move. Behind the portrait, Jonathan found a door partially hidden behind a tattered tapestry. It led down a narrow staircase that spiraled down, deeper into the manor's foundations. The cellar was a labyrinth of stone walls and wooden beams, the air damp and heavy with the scent of mold. Jonathan's lantern flickered, casting long, shifting shadows that seemed to dance along the walls. In the far corner, he found another set of markings similar to those in the hidden chamber. These symbols, however, were accompanied by rusted iron chains bolted into the stone floor. As Jonathan studied the chains, he noticed that the links were stained with dried blood. A chill crept over him. Whoever, or whatever, had been tied here had fought with extreme violence against the bonds. Jonathan was shaken out of his reverie by a noise, a urgent tapping, like the sound he'd heard the night before. It sounded as if it was coming from the walls, getting louder and more insistent. "Hello?" Jonathan said, his voice shaking. The tapping stopped, but this time it was a low, guttural whisper, which made his skin shiver. The words came out faint, but clear. "Leave. before it's too late. Jonathan stumbled backward, clinging to the lantern as the room fell silent. The warning resounded in his mind, yet his determination was unshaken. Whatever curse the Blackthorn family had faced, he was determined to unveil it. Jonathan went back to the study and started comparing the Latin texts with the local folklore. His research indicated that, in the late 17th century, the Blackthorn family had been accused of practicing dark magic. The villagers whispered of secretive rituals held beneath the manor in the dead of night, of sacrifices made to an ancient watcher in exchange for power and prosperity. The rituals had stopped cold in 1685 with the mysterious death of Matthias Blackthorn. The record stated that Matthias had been discovered chained under the floorboards of the East Wing, his body mutilated beyond recognition. The official report blamed the death on an accident, but local legends spoke of retribution from the Watcher for a broken pact. Jonathan's blood ran cold. Was the Watcher still trapped beneath the manor, waiting for the chains to be broken? Jonathan's thoughts were interrupted by the arrival of a letter, brought to him by the manor's caretaker, an old stooping fellow named Elias. The letter, scribbled in hasty handwriting, was from Agnes Harrow, the village elder he had visited the day before. It read, "Mr. Hargrove, I have learned more about your situation. The pendant you carry is not merely an heirloom. It is the key to the ritual that binds the Watcher. You must not use it under any circumstances. Burn this letter after reading it. Trust no one. Agnes Harrow." Jonathan stared at the letter, his hands trembling. The pendant, which he had kept close since finding it, suddenly felt heavier around his neck. That night, Jonathan was woken by a loud crash. Rushing to the source of the noise, he found the chest overturned, its contents scattered across the room. The dagger shone in the moonlight, its blade now blackened as though charred. The book lay open, its pages fluttering despite the absence of wind. The tapping recurred, louder and with a more insistent edge this time. Jonathan twisted his head to see cracks spread across the floorboards. This time, one hand was not enough. A skeletal figure, his wrists and ankles bound in corroded chains, slowly appeared from the floor, his hollow eyes turned towards Jonathan. "You," he rasped in a voice that echoed like an unearthly chorus of damned souls. "You have called me forth." Jonathan backed away, his mind racing. The figure's chains clanked with each movement as it drug itself toward him. Jonathan stood frozen as the skeletal figure loomed over him, its chains jingling with every agonizing movement. Its hollow eyes looked into his soul and somehow conveyed a torment beyond anything that could be comprehended. The house seemed to exhale around him, its very air thickening with oppressive energy. "Why are you here?" Jonathan managed to stammer, his voice shaking. The creature tilted its head, its movements unnaturally jerky. "You," it rasped, each word like a knife scraping against stone. "You carry the key, yet you awaken the curse." The chains wrapped around the creature glowed faintly, pulsing with a sinister energy. Jonathan instinctively reached for the pendant around his neck, its surface burning against his skin. As if he could hear his words, the creature hissed, "Do not trust it. The key will unbind me, but it will doom you." Before Jonathan could say even a word, the floorboard beneath him collapsed. Down into darkness he dropped, the figure's anguished cries echoing through his mind. When at last he landed, he was gasping for wind. Groaning, he struggled to his feet. His lantern had broken on the fall, and it was dark, near totally dark. Feeling in his pocket, he found a matchstick and lit it. In the dim light, a cavernous room beneath the manor could be seen, the walls carved with ancient runes glowing faintly. Chains hung from the ceiling, some of them broken, others holding some unidentifiable object still. There was an altar in the middle of the room, etched with the same symbols he had read about in the book. Bloodstains, dark and old, marred the stone. Jonathan's thoughts were interrupted by a faint voice, soft, almost mournful. It seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. They trapped me here, the voice whispered. Their greed knew no bounds. Who are you? Jonathan asked, turning in circles to locate the source. I was once a guardian, bound to protect, but Matthias, he sought to use my power for his own gain. The voice increased in volume, laced with a deep sorrow. He chained me to this place, feeding me the blood of innocence. When the pact was broken, I was cursed to remain here, neither alive nor dead. Jonathan shivered as the voice continued. You must choose, Jonathan Hargrove. Release me and face the wrath of the house, or leave me to suffer and become its next victim. The match in Jonathan's hand burned low, threatening to extinguish. Before he could light another, a cold wind swept through the cavern, snuffing it out entirely. The glow from the runes heightened and filled the room with a weird light. The shadows along the walls developed and enlarged, growing distinct and assuming the shapes of figures that reached for Jonathan. Jonathan panicked as he fell back. The figures whispered a language he could not make out, their voices mixed into a cacophony of despair. Jonathan's fingers touched the pendant and felt a great warmth wash over his body. Shadows recoiled, hissing at him as the pendant began to glow with a faint light. Use it wisely. A voice came from the walls. The key can bind or break. The glow of the pendant grew until it flooded the cavern with a brilliant light. The shadows all disappeared and were replaced with vivid visions of the past. Jonathan saw Matthias Blackthorne standing at the altar, hooded figures around him. They chanted in unison, their voices rising in a haunting melody. A chained figure knelt before Matthias, its face hidden beneath a hood. Matthias raised a dagger. Jonathan recognized it as the same one he had found and plunged it into the figure's chest. The vision shifted. The Watcher, freed now, stood amidst chaos. Flames were devouring the manor while Matthias screamed in pain as his body contorted into unnatural positions. The Watcher's chains reappeared, pulling him back beneath the floorboards. The vision disappeared and left Jonathan breathless. He could now understand the power of the curse. Jonathan climbed out of the cave, his mind racing. The tale of the Watcher, combined with the visions, painted a grim picture. The Blackthorne legacy was steeped in blood and betrayal, and the pendant he carried was the linchpin of it all. Back in the study, Jonathan laid the pendant on the desk and gazed at it as if it would magically spring to life. He remembered Agnes Harrow's words, "Do not use it under any circumstances." But the Watcher's words stayed in his head. If he left it bound, would he be safe at all? Or would the curse snatch him up as its next victim? That night, the manor became restless. Doors started to open on their own, and windows rattled, though there was no wind. The tapping had returned, louder and more persistent. Jonathan lit a candle and headed into the east wing again. The air felt thicker than before, almost stifling. As he drew closer to the secret door, the tapping stopped. A cold hand clutched his shoulder, and he turned around, thinking that he would see the Watcher. Instead, he was faced with a young woman who had hollow eyes and pale skin. "Free us," she whispered, her voice hardly audible. Before Jonathan could utter a word, she vanished, leaving behind a faint scent of lavender. Desperate for answers, Jonathan searched the library for anything that might help. Hidden behind a row of dusty tomes, he discovered a leather-bound journal. The name, Matthias Blackthorne, was scrawled on the cover. The entries detailed Matthias's descent into madness. He spoke of the Watcher as both a curse and a gift, a source of power that demanded unimaginable sacrifices. One passage stood out. "I have bound it, but the chains grow weaker with each passing year. If the key is ever found, may God have mercy on our souls." Jonathan closed the journal, his resolve hardening. He needed to act, but the path ahead was shrouded in uncertainty. The moon hung low in the sky, casting its pale light through the cracked windows of the manor. Jonathan sat at the old wooden desk, the pendant resting before him. Its eerie glow pulsed in the otherwise dim room, casting strange shadows on the walls. His mind was reeling from the discoveries of the past days. The visions, the warnings, the voice of the Watcher. It all felt like a nightmarish web he couldn't escape from. "Free me, Jonathan, or the house will consume you." The words rang in his head, compelling him to do something that seemed inconceivable. Every nerve in his body was screaming at him, but he couldn't help feel that he was being called into something far older and far darker than he ever could imagine. The air in the study began to chill, and the silence grew more oppressive, suffocating him. The occasional groan of the house became louder, as if its walls listened to him. The feeling of being watched was almost unbearable. Jonathan glanced around the room, his eyes darting from corner to corner. Something shifted in the darkness. His heart leapt, and he rose to his feet, his breathing speeding up. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. "Hello?" he called out, his voice shaking. There was no response. But then he saw it, a figure, fleeting and otherworldly, slipping just beyond his line of sight. Jonathan's pulse was racing. He stumbled backward toward the desk, reaching for the pendant, as if the touch of it might be some kind of security for him. The whisper was soft at first, just a breath of sound against the wind, but it grew louder, more distinct. "Jonathan." He spun around, scanning the room for the source of the voice. Walls seemed to close in upon him, shadows twisting dark fingers in the corners of the room. "Jonathan, you cannot escape." The voice came from behind him, chilling and guttural. It was no longer a whisper, but a commanding tone, filled with ancient malice. His body tensed, and he turned slowly, dreading what he might see. But there was nothing but the cold emptiness of the room. Yet the presence was there. He could feel it, like a weight pressing down on him, an invisible force in the room. The feeling was suffocating, the air thick with dread. Suddenly, the temperature in the room dropped drastically, and the shadows took on a more tangible form. The whispers began again, now accompanied by the unmistakable sound of chains dragging across the floor. Jonathan turned toward the source of the noise, his breath caught in his throat. The figure emerged from the darkened corner. The chains jangled, every movement made by it marked by the abhorrent sound. Jonathan saw it right away. It was the Watcher. Its body was now more defined. It wore tattered remains of what once had been clothing over its skeletal form. Its hollow eyes were aglow with unnatural light, and its bony hand stretched out toward him. "Do you feel it, Jonathan?" The Watcher's voice grated, chains scraping against stone as it drew closer. "The house. It is alive, and it feeds off of your fear." Jonathan backed away a step. The Watcher's presence overwhelmed him, and every urge inside his body screamed out at him to run away. He couldn't. There was something holding his feet in place, leaving him feeling rooted to that spot and unable to budge. "Why are you here?" Jonathan shouted, trying to keep the quiver from his voice. The Watcher tilted his head, his hollowed eyes narrowing. "I am bound to this place, as you are now. The curse was not meant for me alone." Jonathan felt the weight of the Watcher's words settle over him like a suffocating blanket. The curse. The same curse that had bound the Watcher here for centuries. Was it now turning its attention to him? The Watcher's bony fingers scraped the floor as it moved closer, and its voice dropped to a low, menacing tone. "You must understand, Jonathan. This house, this place, it hungers. It seeks to consume those who step inside, and you have come, carrying the key that will either release or destroy us all." Jonathan's mind was racing to process what the Watcher was saying. The pendant. The key. Was it in fact the source of the curse? Could it bind that evil inside the house, or unleash something far worse than that evil? "Can't break the curse?" Jonathan whispered, barely over a breath. The watcher let out a low, rasping laugh. "No one has ever broken it. It is too old, too powerful. You can only choose, release me, or let the house consume you." Jonathan felt a wave of despair wash over him. The watcher's words kept echoing in his mind and grew louder, drowning everything else. Release it, free it, or let the house claim him as its next victim. But as the watcher's chains rattled and the shadows closed in, a sudden thought struck Jonathan. What if there was another way? What if he could break the curse without releasing the watcher, without sacrificing himself to the house? His hand tightened around the pendant, the warmth of its glow comforting him, giving him a flicker of hope. "I won't let you out," Jonathan said sharply, "but I'll find a way to lift this curse." The watcher's eyes flared with a mix of rage and incredulity. "Fool," it sneered, its chains jangling wildly. "You don't know anything. This house is too great for you to conceive of. You can't stop it." Jonathan pushed himself forward, his will steeled. "I'll find a way." The watcher recoiled, its form flickering in and out of existence as the temperature in the room plummeted. "Then you are already lost," the watcher hissed, its voice fading into the shadows. "You are already lost, Jonathan Hargrove." The room seemed to shake, as if it was the very foundations of the manor that moved. Jonathan stumbled backward, heart racing. Shadows in the room seemed to surge toward him, swirling and twisting, like a living thing, as the temperature dropped a little further and the air became thick with unnatural cold. Suddenly the walls cracked like thunder. The house groaned as if it were alive, its ancient timbers creaking and shifting. The floorboards beneath Jonathan's feet began to warp, splitting apart as if the house were opening its maw, preparing to swallow him whole. Jonathan's breath quickened, his pulse racing. The shadows closed in, and he could hear the faint whispers again. The voice of the watcher, the voice of the house. The words were drowned out by the deafening sound of the manor's movements. But one thing was clear. The house was alive, and it was angry. With no time to think, Jonathan raced toward the exit, but the house had already sealed it off. The door slammed shut with a resounding crash, trapping him inside. The shadows surged toward him, and for a moment, he thought he would be consumed by the darkness. But then, with a flash of boldness, Jonathan reached into his pocket and pulled out the journal of Matthias Blackthorne. He flipped through its pages frantically, desperately seeking any clue that may help him. And then he found it. An old, faded diagram of the manor, marked with symbols that matched the runes he had seen beneath the house. There was a marked location, a hidden chamber that seemed to be the source of the house's power. Jonathan's mind raced. This was it, the only way to end the curse. Without time to lose, Jonathan ran through the corridors as the shadows followed him. The whispers became louder, almost deafening. He had no other option but to follow the path laid out in the journal. The manor's fate and his own life depended on his hands. The darkened halls of Hargrove Manor seemed as though they pulsed under the rhythm of something unholy. The house itself seemed a creature, alive, awake to watch and wait, to groan and scrape of floorboards in uncanny regularity, breathing as if heavy with pressure, an unseen, weighty presence that had watched him since the moment of Jonathan's entrance. His heart thudded in his chest with each pulsation, a reminder that his life was on the edge of a knife, and possibly even his soul. The pendant clutched tightly in his hand had started to grow warm, glowing with an otherworldly light as it cast faint illumination over the creased pages of Matthias Blackthorne's journal. The map he had uncovered earlier still seemed to sear into his mind. He said the others should point to the hidden room, a place within the heart of the manor from where the curse was born. There, it could also be undone. But everything inside him screamed at him to turn back, escape this nightmare before it would consume him whole. Now, however, there was no turning back. He had come too far. Jonathan stood in the doorway of the secret room, his heart racing, his breath growing cold. Whispers turned to voices. It filled his ears and clawed at his sanity. "You can't escape. Let me go. The house will never let you go." His breath came in short, ragged gasps as his hand trembled against the cold metal of the door. Symbols etched into the wood pulsed with a strange energy, and he could feel the force behind them, the power that had kept the Watcher captive for so long. Dark magic swirled around him, the kind that bent reality itself, bound spirits to this world long after death should have claimed them. "You are not strong enough." Jonathan ignored the voice. He had heard it too many times now. It was a lie. He was strong enough. He had to be. He turned the handle. The door creaked open with deafening sound, and cold air hit him like a physical blow. The chamber before him was unlike anything he had ever seen. Ancient runes were inscribed upon the stone walls, which glowed dimly in the light of the pendant. Dust and debris lay on the floor, a testament to the years, the centuries perhaps, of abandonment. At the center of the room was a pedestal, and upon it rested an object that seemed to shimmer with unnatural energy. It was an old gilded key, its metal flashing like the teeth of some forgotten beast. Jonathan moved forward, each footfall echoing in the chamber, breaking the silence that had hung so heavy for so long. His eyes were drawn to the key. Its pull was undeniable, as if it had been waiting for him, for this very moment. But just as he was stretching out to grasp it, the air shifted. The room seemed to darken, the shadows growing longer, stretching out toward him. A chilling laugh reverberated through the stone walls, so loud and piercing that it felt like it was coming from within his very mind. "You are too late, Jonathan," the voice rasped, its tone filled with malice. "The curse is already upon you. There is no escape." He froze, his hand inches from the key. The voice was unmistakable. It was the Watcher. The figure of the Watcher emerged from the shadows, its skeletal frame illuminated by the faint glow of the runes. Its hollow eyes locked onto Jonathan, filled with an ancient, indescribable hunger. The chains rattled, their sound like the rattling of bones in a grave. Jonathan stepped back, his heart pounding. The presence of the Watcher was overwhelming, suffocating. It was as though the air itself had turned to lead, heavy and oppressive. The figure grinned, its teeth sharp and jagged. "You cannot stop this, Jonathan," it whispered, its voice filling the space around him. "You are already part of it. The house has claimed you." "No," Jonathan hissed through gritted teeth, forcing himself to take another step forward. "I will stop it. I will break this curse." The Watcher's grin widened. "You think you have a choice? You think you can control the house? It feeds on fear, Jonathan, and you—" It paused, its voice lowering to a whisper. "You are the one it has been waiting for." And then, the earth shook beneath his feet, and the very walls of the chamber gave a great shudder. Along the walls, the runes flared to life, their glare growing bright, and dark shadows stretch and writhe as if they were breathing. The air itself took on a texture, all heavy with the power coursing through the house there. Festering within it for so long was the curse now reaching to its boiling point. Jonathan stumbled, his hands curled over the edge of the pedestal for support. The Watcher stood motionless, eyes fixed on him, its grin now a permanent fixture across its ghastly countenance. The floor beneath him cracked, splintering like brittle wood. The sounds of the house, creaking, groaning, rumbling, filled the air, like the agonizing cries of a dying beast. And in the center of it all was the key, glowing brighter than ever before. Jonathan could feel the pull of the key. It was irresistible. He knew that once he took it, the curse would either be broken, or he would be consumed by it. The decision was his. He could feel the weight of his choice pressing down on him. The Watcher's voice slithered into his mind once again. "You will never be free." Jonathan's mind was racing as the world seemed to cave in on him. The room was spinning, shadows swirling, walls closing in. His breath came in ragged gasps, and the sound of his heartbeat drowned out everything else. Then he recalled the journal of Matthias Blackthorne. That secret chamber, those symbols on it. The key was probably much more complicated. And indeed, there must have been so much to that curse than this Watcher revealed to him. It wasn't about freeing the Watcher and getting out of the house. It was about freeing them from the cycle. That key wasn't about releasing the Watcher after all. It was to stop that thing, and once for all, break free of its hold on this world. With trembling hands, Jonathan grabbed the key, its metal cold and sharp beneath his fingers. The moment he touched it, the chamber erupted in light. The walls shuddered, the air crackling with energy. The shadows screamed, writhing in agony as if they were being torn apart. And then, with a final deafening roar, everything went still. Jonathan stood alone in the center of the chamber, the key still clutched in his hand. The air had returned to normal and the oppressive weight that had crushed him away. The house was silent with a breathless stillness filling the space around him. But something had changed. The shadows were no longer alive. The whispers had stopped. The Watcher, its form had vanished, leaving behind only an empty space where it had once stood. The curse had been broken. Jonathan fell to his knees, his breath ragged, his body trembling from the ordeal. The pendant that had once glowed so brightly was now dull, its power seemingly drained. He had done it. He had broken the curse. But at what cost? As Jonathan slowly rose to his feet, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching him. The house was still there, still ancient and alive, but its grip on him had loosened. He had won. But as he walked out of the chamber, his footsteps echoing in the empty halls, he heard a faint, distant whisper. "You cannot escape." Jonathan froze. The heartbeats thumping in his chest made it hard to breathe. Again, the whispers returned, this time soft, and then louder. The house was still watching, just waiting for the next prey. The curse might be broken for now, but its hunger would never really die. With a last, tired look at the manor behind him, Jonathan stepped out into the frigid night. He got away, for now.